Hello and welcome to Overthink,
the podcast that weds philosophy with everyday life.
I am David Peña Guzman.
And I'm Ellie Anderson.
As always, for an ad-free extended version of this episode, community discussion, and a lot more, subscribe to us on Substack. Ellie, I feel like weddings are everywhere lately. It's really shaping up to be the year of the wedding. I'm thinking about how weddings have been super central to a lot of TV shows and movies. I'm here thinking about the drama. Something very bad is going to happen. The final season of Euphoria has a wedding at the center of it. And some people have tied this to the fact that Gen Z is now at the age of getting married. And also, in June, summer 2026 got a kickoff with Dua Lipa and Callum Turner's gorgeous wedding in Sicily.
Oh, that brought me so much joy to see but I will say, I am getting married in California. Trevor and I are both California born and raised. And so I think, all our loved ones live here. This is a natural place to get married. Without disclosing too many details in advance of it happening, because there are some weirdos who listen to this podcast, that unfortunately is the case. I will say, we're not getting married in LA. It will be a little bit more of a lovely countryside location. And in fact, it's the place we're having our reception is where my parents had their rehearsal dinner.
What? I didn't know that. I mean, you've shown me the pictures. I won't divulge beyond that, but it does look beautiful and I'm very excited to be there. And, weddings always bring a sense of calm and peace, but everything leading up to them is nothing short of chaos. And so I'm curious whether you've experienced the chaos of the planning of the wedding, the making decisions about the wedding.
Yeah. Well, in fact, Elizabeth Freeman has this book called The Wedding Complex, which is something else that I read in advance of this episode and that I'm going to be returning to over the course of this episode. She's an English professor and she makes a really interesting point about that. And then I'll answer your question directly about my chaos. She talks about how in literary theory, the wedding is often described in terms of narrative closure. There's a kind of happily ever after at the end of a story. Think about how many fairy tales, Shakespearean comedies, and films end in a wedding. But Freeman points out that things are very different when the wedding is the plot rather than just the end point of the plot. When weddings are the plot of the story, the drama is, and the TV show, Something Very Bad Is Going to Happen. These are both great examples of this. When weddings are the plot, narrative and social chaos are the order of the day. So I guess it remains to be seen whether that will be the case for me because I have some time left. But one of the decisions that Trevor and I made very early on was to hire a planner, what's known as a partial planner in the industry, because now I've learned all the terms. And the partial planner has been truly amazing. I will happily advertise her services on Instagram after, because she has been so incredible. And so that's helped, I would say, with a lot of the logistics, because we are doing we're doing a whole weekend thing. We'll talk about this more in detail later in the episode. But I think the idea that a whole weekend wedding is extravagant and absurd is an unfair characterization. I'm I want people to get down and party. This is the biggest party I will ever host. And so let's do it. Let's have fun. We're having a roast ceremony the night before, which is a Mangalorean tradition from Trevor's side, where basically we get a bunch of coconut milk and oil poured over our heads. And sometimes it gets a little rowdy. So we're doing that. Also, one of my rules was that, with the exception of the actual wedding dress, which I presume I will unfortunately only have a chance to wear once because I did want something kind of, fun and
classical,
fashion-y. Yeah. I was I don't want any other components to be things I can only wear once. So I'm not wearing white for the welcome party. I'm wearing one of my favorite bright colors. My after party dress is also not white. And I'm just I'm actually kind of more excited about those components of it now because
well, my views about wedding dresses. I think it's a travesty that people spend all this money on a dress that they only wear once. So Dude. I told you, from now on, I expect you to show up to any online or professional events that we do together wearing your wedding dress.
David, I know. I went wedding dress shopping with my mom, my aunt, and my cousin. I ended up getting the dress. Well, yeah, I ended up getting the dress that my mom instantly started sobbing when she saw me wear. I just did kind of get got. And I've been feeling mixed about that ever since. As you know, I have like profound ambivalence about spending a lot of my hard-earned money on a wedding dress. Even though, I mean, it's so crazy. Some people are spending like $15K on a dress. I'm definitely not spending that. But still, I'm just like, okay, is it worth it to look hot on my wedding day?
Today, we are talking about weddings.
To what extent are weddings bound to institutions of patriarchal marriage?
How do wedding ceremonies both separate and bond the couple to their community?
And are big weddings a waste of money? Weddings are ceremonies that inaugurate a marriage, usually between two spouses. But they are conceptually distinct from the marriage itself. At least that's what Freeman, the author of that book, The Wedding Complex I mentioned a couple minutes ago, argues. Freeman notes that the expressive, theatrical, and symbolic aspects of the wedding are not equivalent to the institution of marriage. And she writes about how she first came to realize this by seeing how delightful and attractive weddings can be, even for those who are critical of the institution of marriage. She was an activist for same-sex partnership benefits in the early 1990s. And as part of that, she was involved in things like mass marry-ins for same-sex partners. And she found that many queer people, although critical of marriage, still wanted weddings. And this wasn't just like a false consciousness. It was a lot richer than that. She thinks that it was partly a response to the fact that Western culture lacks public modes of expression for emotional ties that fall outside structured kin groups. And so pulling in what would like traditionally not be taken as kin groups through these mass marry-ins to, you know, this ceremony that traditionally is about structured kin groups had something subversive to it.
Yeah, keeping in mind the separation of marriage and wedding is really important because you can get married without a wedding. And I've been to weddings that do not entail a legal marriage, like a marriage of radical fairies in the woods of Tennessee. But
I'm still not sure that we're going to actually make it legal. We probably will for tax purposes, but yeah, we haven't really gotten that far. That's not our purpose in getting married.
No, that's right. But I think also this idea that there is something beyond a false consciousness
in
desiring.
Sorry, I just said it's not. I just did the conflation. I said it's not our purpose in getting married is not our purpose in getting married. I meant getting married is not our purpose in having a wedding. Okay, I conflated the two. Anyway, sorry, David, continue.
No, but so you're talking about how the desire for a wedding is not reducible to false consciousness or to wanting to participate in the problematic institution of marriage, for many reasons. And I really feel that myself because if you remember back in 2021 on our show, I went public with this declaration that I would never get married. And then fast forward a year, I got married and had a wedding in Paris.
Dude, this was so wild. We literally had a whole marriage episode in 2021. I was like, oh, I'm critical of many features of marriage, but I'll probably get married one day. David was like, I will never get married. And then I saw one of our student assistants, our former student assistants, a year later. She was like, wait, did I see that David got married? And I was like, oh, why, yes, indeed, he did.
So, yes, I got married and wedded. And I have to say it was a lovely wedding. It was very small. You mentioned your wedding planning work, the logistics, all of that. For me, it was a very different experience because my wedding was only 30 people. It was non-traditional. There was no exchange of rings. There were no vows. But still, it had some elements that just scream wedding. Like my partner, Rabi, wore a beautiful gender-bending white, I guess you would call it an outfit. It was not quite a dress and it was not pants. Yeah, but it was not a full skirt. It was a skirt
pants combo.
Yeah. But it that.
Yeah, I say this from photos because you planned your wedding too last minute for me to be able to arrive. You were like, oh, I'm getting married in 3 weeks in Paris. And I was like, girl, I'm sorry. I can't come.
I know. I haven't told
very sad.
I haven't told you, but I'm not going to make it to your wedding in revenge. No,
dude,
I'm kidding.
I'm getting married I'll not be there. That far from you. So yeah.
Well, yeah. So this is interesting because we decided to get married largely for practical reasons, right? So it had to do with immigration. It had to do with us trying to figure out how to solve or undo this knot at the heart of our relationship, which is how do we live together in the same place? And so in order to do that, we came to the conclusion that we had to get legally married. And so once we made that decision, we initially planned to do a marriage without a wedding. No celebration, just the two of us at the mayor's office in Paris. And then once the word got out to our immediate family and our very close friends, very slowly we got the pressure. Well, maybe you should at least do drinks after the marriage. Maybe you should have a small dinner for the witnesses. Maybe the dinner could be expanded to include, your immediate circle. And then before we knew it, we were in the range of 30 to 40 people.
Yes.
And suddenly we have to have a wedding. And we ended up renting this kind of fancy, very beautiful rooftop in Paris in the Galerie Lafayette, this kind of shopping center, which sounds weird to say that you get married in a shopping center. But this is like a really nice Haussmannian building in the center of Paris in the 9th district. And so in the end, it worked out perfectly, but it was a minimalistic wedding by the standards of modern day weddings. And I'm very happy about having had the wedding because it gave us a ton of memories. It brought together social circles in our lives that otherwise would have never overlapped. And it also was a public declaration of our affection for one another. And I do think that the mere act of declaring, especially in a celebratory and affirmative and festive context, can have a transformative effect on the relationship about which the declaration is being made.
Yes, I'm so glad you're saying this because so many academics don't have weddings, either because they don't get married to begin with or because they just want like a small courthouse wedding. I'm like, yeah, those are some of my favorite parties. Like, I want to have that amazing party. I actually love the ceremony. I think the ceremony, when done right, can be the most profound part of a wedding. In general, I just want more ceremonies. I kind of alluded to this earlier. I want the divorce ceremony. I want the getting a new job ceremony. I want the you decided to be single for the rest of your life ceremony. I want the you added a new person to your relationship and now you're in a triad. I want the pet parties. You got a new pet? Okay, I'm not particularly an animal person, but I would love to come to your pet party.
You need to buy a $14,000 dress for the pet party. The economic ante just goes up and up and up with all these parties.
Yeah, but I think that would also remedy some of the asymmetry that leads people to be annoyed about weddings, which is like, I'm buying ticket to your bachelorette party, to your wedding, buying you a gift, a shower gift, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, I think if we had more ceremonies, then the stakes would be lower for each of these individually. But I think this reminds me of Freeman's point, which is that the wedding serves a function that gets overlooked by critics of marriage, especially those who call for its abolition. Weddings, she says, at the very least, at once symbolize and multiply social ties, work in and with time, allow someone to be the star of the show, suggest the possibility of bodily and social transformations, and offer an elaborate series of visual icons to play with. So that's a lot of functions that weddings are serving, many of which are special in a society where we don't get a lot of opportunities for those things.
Yeah. But I think it's important to also consider the objection that somebody might make here, which is that even though weddings have all of these functions, they perform those functions largely because of their proximity to marriage, to legal marriage, as recognized by the state. And so, how would we respond then to the argument that even if weddings can perform all these social functions, mixed in with those functions is also the legitimation and the continuation of what we might consider to be a problematic legal institution? Because, most people, let's be honest, if they're going to have a wedding, it's because they're getting married, unless they're like those radical
Legally
fairies
married.
I mentioned. Legally married, unless they're the radical fairies in the woods.
Well, totally. And I mean, I think that was very obvious from the fact that I slipped between saying wedding to getting married. I think that maybe even happened like one or two other times in our conversation. So I don't think it's as easy as saying weddings are unproblematic and marriage is problematic. And I think this is something I've thought a lot about in deciding whether to have a wedding of my own and whether to get married. But I have to say, in reading about the history, not only of weddings, but also of marriage, I'd become pretty comfortable with my decision. For instance, in her wonderful book, Marriage, A History, Stephanie Coontz debunks two common patriarchal ideas of marriage. The first is that marriage is an institution that protects women. And second is that marriage is an institution that oppresses women. And so this idea that marriage, is essentially patriarchal because it's either protecting and or oppressing women. Those are technically two different narratives, but I could see them working in tandem. She says is just way too simple. Although marriage has very often served these functions, those are not endemic to marriage itself. The history of marriage is much more complex, in short. And the most enduring function of marriage that she sees throughout its history is to establish kinship and community ties. That is, marriage speaks to the needs of the larger group. And I think, that's a big reason why I've made my choices too. Like, it's partly for family, friends, it's for a broader community. And that's not to be like, oh, see, we've decided marriage isn't problematic, leave it at that. But I think that book just helped me realize it's really not that simple.
Well, and that coheres with what I said earlier about making a public declaration of love, and also about the bringing together of various members of the community that belong to our lives, but that wouldn't overlap. And that's the social/communitarian orientation of these celebrations. And we'll come back to the question of whether marriage is primarily about like the couple or the community. But for now, I want to focus on the ceremonial dimension of a marriage, which is what we call the wedding. And I want to talk about that a little bit more because there is not a lot of philosophical work on weddings, not surprisingly.
Yeah.
In fact, I couldn't really find a single article or book in our discipline devoted to the topic specifically. I kept looking and looking and looking.
Oh, all the stuff I'm bringing in is from sociology, anthropology, gender studies,
history,
and English.
Yeah, a lot of communication studies with like the symbolism as well. So that was really revealing that philosophy has had so little to say about weddings. But I did find one article from the philosopher Jonathan Wolff. And the article is about ceremonies. And he has some interesting things to say about ceremonies that he believes apply to weddings. So Wolff is trying to understand what it is that a ceremony is. What are we doing socially when we gather together collectively in order to mark a momentous event in life? And he argues that ceremonies have all these defining features, right? Like they're communal, there are formalities associated with them, they are departures from the ordinary, so on and so forth. But the two criteria that I want to focus on for a hot second are what he calls, first and foremost, the social dimension of ceremonies. So he says, ceremonies involve a lot of what Habermas calls social drama, meaning that when you go to a ceremony, you don't show up as your typical, average, everyday self. Rather, you show up in your role as a particular persona, like supportive friend, citizen, educator, right? Like, so you have to put on a certain image, and that can come in the form of specific makeup, specific clothes, following specific rules of engagement. And so in attending a ceremony, we're not just attending an event, but we're actually stepping up to a theatrical plate where there are certain social roles to be fulfilled. So that's the first one, the social drama. The second one is what Wolff himself calls a lot of fuss, which I thought was a great philosophical category through which to interpret ceremonies. And what he means by that is not just like the chaos of organizing ceremonies, although that's part of it, but rather the fact that ceremonies usually are there to achieve a specific goal, right? So we said weddings are there to facilitate the goal of marriage. But technically, Wolff says, you could achieve the end goal without all the ornamentation and all the planning and all the fuss that usually goes into a wedding. But what makes a wedding and a ceremony is precisely that extravagance, that going beyond, that almost like yearning for opulence. And that's essential to his understanding of ceremonies. And I think that's a really good way to think about weddings, that they are places for social drama and a hell of a lot of fuss.
I love this so much. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on the basis of it, but one of them is that like the super gendered character of a bridezilla is very often just a woman who's been raised thinking that getting married is very important for her sense of self and who is taking on an immense number of logistics, leaning in, we might say, to the fuss. And so I think like Jonathan Wolf's reclaiming of fuss allows us to maybe have a little bit more sympathy for the women who are characterized as bridezillas. I'd be curious to like rewatch, Say Yes to the Dress or something with this in mind. And I think the fact that we tend to dismiss fuss is such a gendered part of weddings. And so, for instance, I've been getting served a lot of bridal content in the past year. That's what happens when you like search a wedding dress on Instagram once.
That's what happens when the algorithm identifies you as a bridezilla to be.
Yeah, right? But so like the bridezilla is exactly what every bride doesn't want to be. And there's like the opposite of that, which you see a lot of content on the internet if you have my algorithm, which is the anti-bride. And it's like, well, who is the anti-bride? The anti-bride is literally just a bride, but a cool bride. And so I was thinking about this a little bit in terms of some of the stuff we talked about in our recent coolness episode as well, like this stance of sort of ironic distance that one has to have, because it is about playing into the fuss just in virtue of having a wedding and also that social drama, but seeming like you're above the social drama and seeming like you're above the fuss because, your cake looks a little bit different. Your dress is not necessarily from a bridal boutique, but is like, some like Frankenstein vintage creation. You got like a top from the Goodwill and a skirt from, some antique flea market or whatever, and then mash them together.
Well, no, I think that's a really interesting point about the fuss, because Wolf makes the argument that fuss is there for all ceremonies, even the most like hyper masculine. So if you think about it like a military ceremony, or like a presidential swearing in, those have a lot of fuss. But I think you're right to point to the gender dynamic, especially when it comes to like everyday ceremonies that average people perform. And I read one article in preparation for this episode that made a really interesting argument, which is that ceremonies like weddings give us a rare opportunity that we rarely get again in our lives, which is the opportunity to act like celebrities for a day. And think about that, right? When you are a bride or a groom, if you choose to lean in and not be the anti-bride or the anti-groom, although I guess every groom is the anti-groom because of the gender expectations around wedding planning. But if you think about that, on your wedding day, you can be demanding, you can be picky, you can be choosy, you can be kind of mean to other people, and all the attention is meant to be on you. And so it kind of taps into that. But I do agree that that gets played out in gendered specific ways. And you see that. I mean, I've seen a few episodes of that like Bridezilla show. I forget the name of it. Maybe it was just Bridezilla. And the women are vilified for leaning into something that we... Bridezillas. What did I say?
You said Bridezilla, so it was close. It's just, the multiple.
Yeah, and I think women are punished for leaning into something that we nonetheless expect them to do and to want to do, but without showing that they're actually enjoying.
Yeah. Well, and as one example of the fact that brides are expected to do this work, I mean, there's a lot of we could go further back well before engagement and talk about the ways that girls are socialized to want weddings with men from a young age through a wide variety of factors. But one of the things that like really struck me, I knew when I decided to have a wedding to a man, no less,
the shock
that there would be some gendered expectations that we'd have to cut against, and some which we might, kind of lean into. I populated our entire registry in one single day over like Christmas break, and it was so much fun. I literally loved it. So anyway, that I'm, fine with kind of leaning into. But one of the things that really struck Trevor and me was that our wedding planner has like a portal that she uses. It's not just for her. It's like a general portal. And it has all of these tasks, like at least 100, maybe even hundreds of tasks that have to be completed before the wedding. And there were only a handful that were default assigned to the groom. All of the rest of the tasks were assigned to the bride and or to the wedding planner. And the ones that were assigned to the groom were buy a tux and get a haircut. Get a haircut. I'm like, oh, I've got my whole bridal beauty plan in place. I'm doing my micro needling 4 times a year, which I talked about in our recent beauty episode. Like, there's so many things I'm doing. I'm getting special like balayage hair done. I have to get my hair and makeup done. You know, I don't have to, but yeah, kind of. You know, with the normative expectations of the wedding, we were just like, Trevor and I were dying over the fact that get a haircut was on there.
I think they forgot take a bath, but like the standard
Brush
is so
your
low.
Teeth.
I wonder how that portal works when it's 2 people of the same sex, especially 2 men.
Yeah.
You know, I just joked about how Rabbi and I, 2 men getting married. Maybe we leaned into that stereotype by having a very minimalistic wedding.
Yeah,
we did get a haircut and we did buy our outfit. That was about it.
You sure did. You sure did. And I will say we ended up reassigning a bunch of the tasks. So it's not as though those are actually the only things that Trevor ended up doing. Like a lot of the things that were default assigned to me, we switched over to him. So yeah, he's doing more than that.
Well, I'm glad that Trevor is bucking those gender norms when it comes to the wedding.
I mean, I'm still wearing the white dress. Let's be real. I'm doing a lot of preparation that I have perhaps more or less willingly subjected myself to. Anyway, I would say maybe you and Rabi are a little bit bucking gender norms as well, given the intersection of, sort of norms of femininity and masculinity with gay men. Because one thing that came up quite a bit in my research is the alliance of women and gay men in the wedding industry, because so many gay men are designers and planners, just not you guys, you know?
Oh yeah, no, we've walked away from that alliance a long time ago. We were kicked off by the women, actually.
Yeah, well, and if feminine socialization, I mentioned the socialization of girls, but I think we could broadly say feminine socialization has a lot to do with kind of envisioning your wedding, then I think we can say that like a lot of gay boys are conscripted into that as well, even if just imaginatively. And I think really it's hard to overstate how important weddings are, though, for so many women. So to go back to women rather than just like feminine socialization here, one survey found that 6 out of 10 single women have their weddings already planned. And most start thinking about their dream weddings in elementary school. That is definitely the case for me. There's some journal I have somewhere from middle school that literally goes through all of the details of the wedding that I want to have, you know, and whatever. I thought I was going to get married at 27. I'm so glad I didn't.
I'm glad you didn't too. But I think this speaks a lot to the way marriage is set up as the goal for women specifically. So even if we want to disentangle, let's say, the wedding ceremony from the marriage that follows or that it's meant to lead to, the desirability of marriage for women historically is not actually separable from the idealization and the fantasy around having this ideal wedding that you already observed with young girls that, you know, start thinking about what this special day is going to look like from the moment they're from a very young age.
Yeah, this is true. And it intersects also with the feminine stereotype of women being into spectacle and aesthetics, you know, that being a celebrity for a day because you're the bride. And Chris Ingraham calls this the wedding industrial complex. Which I think is
I
great.
love that. Love that.
But she also notes that there are big disparities racially. Black couples spend far less and Hispanic couples less than white or Asian couples on average in weddings based in the U.S.
I mean, that's true for the two of us. Your wedding will have cost a lot more than mine just because we were lazy and planned a very small wedding.
I also was like, I'm getting married later than a lot of my friends. It's basically a family reunion. Like, we're kind of doing it.
It's going to be a lot of fuss there. Ellie, there's a lot out there on this wedding industrial complex, but I want us to focus on the ritual side of weddings here. The actual signs, the symbols, the iconography that appear in weddings. And I found some really interesting research on this that might help us think about weddings in a new way.
Yeah, and we'll say I think the symbols, signs and symbols we're going to focus on are mainly like European and American weddings in a roughly Christian tradition, right? So just to sort of say, like, there's so much we could talk about, as always, on Overthink. We'll be kind of focusing on that dimension of things. But before we get into the details, I'll say that an overarching point that I found fascinating is that weddings, generally speaking, were originally social, not religious or legal. It's easy to see weddings, I think, as tools of the state or tools of religious higher-ups, but that is just not the case. And I think this was also like a really liberating realization for me, is like, oh, weddings aren't just some like messed up tool of the state, right? In fact, it wasn't until the 16th century on the European continent and 1753 in England that governments and churches could enforce a rule requiring specific legal and public formalities to validate a marriage. And then on the religion side, it wasn't until well over a millennium after Christianity was established that Christianity started caring about marriage. In fact, the early Christians were anti-marriage because Jesus advocated the breaking of worldly ties, also famously unmarried.
Yeah, famously unmarried guy. And a lot of the traditions that those of us who grew up in predominantly Christian contexts associate with our marriage rights, you know, like think about the dresses and the adornments and all of that, they really predate Christianity and were originally of a pagan origin. The scholar Brooke Leaney wrote an article entitled Something Borrowed, which is about what Christianity borrowed from early Roman traditions and also what it rejected, especially as Christians started, you know, caring more about weddings and marriage once they realized that, like, hey, this is here to stay, and so we need to take a stance in order to align it with our faith. And she points out in this article that the exchange of rings, the expression of mutual consent through the verbalization of vows, the wearing of the veil, the iconic kind of climactic kiss, all of these traditions were already rooted in Roman rites. And so they are not things that the Christians originated. They are just things that they borrowed. But even though the Christians borrowed a bunch of things, they also intentionally rejected a number of traditions that were central to Roman weddings because they thought that those did not and could not be aligned with the rising Christian faith. So, for example, it was very common for Roman weddings to involve a number of blood sacrifices, including of animals, you know, like on various days of the ceremony. And so the Christians were like, this is looking a little demonic. Maybe we don't incorporate that into our weddings. They also were really worried about hairdos of all things. So apparently in Roman times...
It is an important part of the fuss, David. Don't say of all things with that disdainful tone.
All the Roman brides were the original bridezillas.
Oriented gay man.
Well, so I found this really interesting because it was expected for Roman brides to do their hair in a very specific way. Like they would take a sword and part it down the middle in a ritualistic fashion, and then they would divide it into 3 curls on each side, and it had all this meaning. And the Christians...
sounds like really chopped.
Yeah, they all came out looking like they just had their perm done. But so the Christians thought that all this concern with aesthetics, with look, with image was an expression of vanity. And so it was incompatible with Christian virtue. So you can get wedded down the road as a Christian, but you can't not have a fancy haircut. That's the rule. One final detail that I want to add here to understand just this new position that the church is taking in relation to weddings and why. They also explicitly reject the wearing of a crown of flowers. Roman brides would pick on the day of their wedding, they would go out and pick flowers, and then they would make a crown out of it and they would wear it. I think that's really beautiful, honestly.
Yeah, me too. If I were
telling
getting
you-
married in 2008, I definitely would have worn a flower crown. But I said earlier, I'm kind of down with just leaning into wedding trends. And I mean, minimalism is the order of the day right now. Minimalist elegance.
Well, you could have minimalistic flowers, maybe, to reconcile the two.
Nah,
But
your algorithm's not showing you the same thing as it's showing me. Anyway, maybe I'll buck the trend and wear a flower crown after all.
yeah, but so the Christians were really worried about the wearing of the crown of flowers because they worried that it mimicked the crown of thorns of Jesus Christ, and that only martyrs and people of proven true religious merit should ever wear a crown. And so that was like a really, really contentious issue actually during the early Christian period. And a lot of what we know about Christian weddings comes from the Christian theologian Tertullian, who was a philosopher, theologian, and wrote extensively about Christian metaphysics and ethics. But apparently this crown issue was such a big deal that Tertullian wrote an entire book about the polemic of wearing a crown on your wedding day. The book was called De Corona, and he just rails against brides wearing a crown.
Wow. The original gay wedding designer, in fact. This is not this, but that trends. Okay, so anyway, I find it really interesting that so many of the rituals we associate with weddings today originated with the Romans, especially those that we, associate with Christian or Christian adjacent weddings. One thing that Freeman points out in the wedding complex is that although the verbal exchange of vows predates Christianity, Christianity really ended up making this aspect of weddings a focal point. With the rise of Christian adoption of marriage norms, we mentioned they're originally kind of anti-marriage, then come around. The I do then became the very apex of the Christian wedding, this expression of verbal consent.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that the I do of the wedding is not just a verbal expression. It's not just like a sound we make. It's what the philosopher J.L. Austin calls a performative. It's an utterance that literally brings about a new state of affairs. Because once you say I do, your legal standing is otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, under the right conditions. Check out our performativity episode for more on that. I want to pivot now to talking about rituals that aren't necessarily Christian, but are very capitalist. So like more recent ones. And these are the rituals associated with the white wedding. The white wedding became standard in the US during the mid to late 19th century when marriage was legally connected to race, nationality, monogamy, and physical health. And so those, are social and political dynamics that even if we say marriage is not merely a tool of the state, there's a lot going on there in who has access to the white wedding. And one of the books that I read traced the origin of the white wedding to the US in the 1830s. But certainly what I was seeing more is that the white wedding was really popularized in the 1840s with two viral weddings, both of which Laurie Essig discusses in the book Love, Inc. The first is Queen Victoria's wedding to Prince Albert, which involved her wearing a fancy white dress and diamond ring. And white dresses had emerged in England for brides as early as the mid-1600s, but a lot of couples after that point had continued simply to wear their best clothes, which often were not white. So regardless of color, you just put on your Sunday best. Victoria's white dress really codified white as the bridal color. And the second wedding, which you're less likely to have heard of than Queen Victoria's, but nonetheless was super important during this time period, is the celebrity wedding of General Tom Thumb, whose actual name is Charles Stratton, to Lavinia Warren 2 decades later. Stratton, whose stage name was General Tom Thumb, was a performer with dwarfism who had been adopted as a child by P.T. Barnum and then traveled all over with Barnum's circus. And his wedding to Lavinia Warren was such a big deal that everyone was vying for tickets to it. P.T. Barnum sold tickets to the reception. Abraham Lincoln even invited the couple to spend their honeymoon at the White House.
Oh, what?
Yeah. And then after their wedding, Americans began staging Tom Thumb's wedding pageants, where they would use children to play the bride and groom.
Oh, yikes. It went from like really cool that they got invited to the White House to like, this is really gross.
No, I know. You're like, oh, yay. On the one hand, you know, the one of the most important weddings in establishing the white wedding tradition is that between two Americans with dwarfism. On the other hand, like, okay, we
questions
got
of spectacle,
we got
and
spectacle,
ableism, and wow.
Totally. On a slightly lighter note, I'm going to jump ahead now to the 1980s because another big shift in the wedding industry happened around then. The 80s and the 90s were big decades for rom-coms that centered weddings, as well as just like wedding movies. My Best Friend's Wedding, for instance. And also around this time of the 80s and 90s, couples started having wedding videography for the first time rather than just still photos. And this was so interesting to me. It's during this time that the cake smashing ritual, where you not only cut the cake with your partner, but you smash it into their faces, came to the fore.
Oh.
And it actually came first from romantic comedies, but then it became popular in real life because people were like, ooh, I want a video of me smashing the cake into my partner's face. Like, it's so cute and rom-com coded.
Oh my God, when real life mimics art. But I think this does highlight the extent to which weddings have become spectacle in recent decades. And I don't just mean here spectacle in the sense that they are big events or big ceremonies, but that they are maybe, and have been for a while, planned and organized with the explicit intent of making them look good as spectacle, where it's not just that you plan it and then you display it, but you plan it in order to be displayed.
Totally.
And that display, of course, like, it could mean that you plan it to make them videotapable in the language of the 80s and 90s, or that you plan them in such a way that they are Instagrammable, using more contemporary terminology there.
Oof,
but there's a real way in which the wedding planning is very clearly not for the couple who is getting married or wed. It is for others to look at and to be amazed at the beauty of this institution.
Totally. Influencer culture has really changed this. In fact, even some of the actual wedding rituals, you know, the more Instagrammable ones are, you know, likely to become more popular, the less Instagrammable ones to be less popular. I'll say, you know, I've even been feeling this quite a bit myself. We're not having a big wedding cake because they're expensive as heck, but we're having a small cutting cake. What's the purpose of having a small cutting cake? So you have cute photos of yourself cutting a small cake. Yeah. And then like,
they're usually fake things. They're not even real cakes, the ones that you cut.
They're real cakes.
Yeah, no, not always, but sometimes it's like a fake cake that you cut and then they take it back, and then what gets served to the guests is from a different cake.
It's usually just a mini version.
I know, but I'm saying there are some, where they're made of cardboard and they look pretty. Yeah, I'm not saying your wedding is doing this, but this is actually a thing.
Okay, we need fact checkers on the case here. Maybe that's right. But and also Trevor, even though he works in film, he doesn't want a videographer because he's like, I don't want to be worried about whether this is like video worthy on the day of. I feel kind of agnostic about that because I do have friends who love watching their videos, but I think, you know, the fact that those are even considerations that come up for us when we're wedding planning, and the fact that so many people find themselves so obsessed with how their wedding's going to look after the fact that they can't even focus on the actual day speaks to this spectacular element of the weddings. So we've come to the point where we get to discuss a question we flagged earlier. This is a question I've really been excited to talk about. And that is maybe less a question and more of a tension to unpack, which is the tension between how the wedding separates a couple from their other relationships, literally putting them on a pedestal to be viewed by others. It symbolizes their bond, the bond between the two of them and only the two of them. But at the same time, it is a profoundly social event. And so that tension gives weddings a kind of paradoxical status, at least in the present day, given, you know, the structure of the weddings that we tend to have in the US. In her book on courtship, Ellen Rothman suggests that this tension emerges in the 19th century, where wedding ceremonies waffled between being an emblem and extension of communal being and being a figure for and means of withdrawal from the larger society. And part of this also has to do with a move towards a more contractual view of marriage, where marriage is understood as a private arrangement based on the will of the parties involved.
Yeah, so I like this tension a lot. Is a marriage and a wedding primarily about the couple or about the community? I have to say that I tend to lean towards seeing weddings as primarily communal because of their ceremonial nature. And the reason is because ceremonies are, by their very definition, public events that are geared toward a large audience, right? So they are spectacles, but aside from that, they really foreground the individual for a public, right? So even if we think about a ceremony like a birthday party where it's about one person, it's about the place of that individual in a larger community. Now you're 1 year older, there are certain expectations that change, so on and so forth. And, it's certainly the case that the person or the couple are important, but it's about that new socially legible role that they are called upon to perform before the eyes of the community. So I think a wedding without that communal dimension just like wouldn't really be much of a wedding, at least not in a recognizable way. Like if two people get married in a forest and it doesn't make a sound, is it really a wedding?
David. Okay. So yeah, I think this is also really important to keep in mind when it comes to the cost of weddings, because I agree with you. I think weddings are primarily communal. That doesn't mean that they're not communally staging a, spectacle of the private bond of the couple, but I do think their main function is a communal one. One thing I hear a lot from anti-brides is like, oh my God, weddings are so overpriced, so expensive, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, that is true. The wedding industrial complex is real and it is absurd. And at the same time, I think sometimes people conflate like the wedding markup with the actual cost of putting on a giant party for people. And I think the latter thing is something worth celebrating and not necessarily extravagant or silly or let alone selfish, right? And so I'm thinking about it this way. So I have a big family. We were going to do a family reunion this year. Instead of doing a family reunion, they're coming to my wedding. I think also some of this is influenced by the fact that not only is Trevor half Indian, but also my sister's husband is Indian and they had a big Indian wedding. I go to a number of them, various cousins, and that's often an event that's not only multi-day, but also that involves like when we had wedding celebrations for my sister in India, it would be literally 500 people. The entire town would be invited. And so I think thinking about weddings as not just a lump sum of money that is paid for by the couple and or their families, but rather in terms of like how much it costs per head for each of those people to have a really good time. I mean, we're looking at like a 275 person wedding. So when I'm thinking about the cost of that
Jesus.
wedding, yeah, no, I know. I really I will not lie. I'm still needing to pool some of my resources together. I've been saving up a lot for this, but yeah, no, we're like I said, we're kind of going for it. Like, okay, well, dividing the cost of that wedding by those 275 people and thinking about like, hopefully the fun that they'll have, the memories they'll have, all the weddings that I've gone to where I have been fed delicious food and gotten to hang out with friends. I just think it's worth distinguishing the evils of the capitalist wedding industrial complex from the fact that weddings are big communal celebrations that do in the world we live in cost money, although you can be judicious about where you spend your money.
Yeah, although I mean in that case we should have big parties without all the things that make those parties into like weddings in the commercial sense, right?
Which is also what I want.
But it's not what you're doing, and it's not what I did either, right? So like we are participating in the wedding industrial complex because I didn't need to buy new clothes for my wedding, but I did.
I think I'm tempted to say this is like the first time I feel I can actually afford that. Like, I got tenure and stuff like that, but get back to me in 5 years and I'll tell you if I had like
when
a
you're still paying the debt
birthday party.
No, but I agree that if we think about weddings in terms of what would a party like this for this number of people be worth? That changes the discussion. But of course, the wedding markup that you mentioned is really hard to justify. And that's where we get into this capitalism versus what's actually just a celebration of community and being together. Yeah. But to return to the tension that you introduced a few minutes ago, Ellie, maybe we can think more about what aspects of a wedding tell us that the wedding is about the creation of a space of intimacy for the couple. It's about solidifying a couple. And what aspects of the wedding are more geared toward the broader community? So which aspects of a wedding would you say lean toward the primacy of the couple?
Yeah. The first look where the groom sees the bride, I don't know if that's also a thing with gay weddings. And then also definitely the vows. The vows is an expression of love and commitment, which often kind of provide a window onto the privacy of the couple, even though they're being witnessed by others, and which tend to mean a lot for the couple themselves itself.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good example. And I think that is achieved more when the vows are intimate and sort of really personalized, like tailored to the other person rather than more generic vows that people say at weddings.
Yeah.
I think that's a really compelling example, the vows. But I do think that it can go either way depending on how the vows are performed. So when the vows are generic, I think it's primarily for the community, right? Because you're performing that social function or that social role or the persona of the person to be married. But when they are tailored and personalized in targeted to the particular individual, there it does seem like you are creating a space of intimacy and envisioning the union or the companionship of two individuals. There it's about the individuals rather than the social function. Another example that I think can go either way, that it can be about the community or about the couple, is the veil. So today, the veil, at least in these largely Christian contexts that we're focusing on, the veil is white, and the symbolism is that it protects the bride from other men, right? It blocks vision so that she can't see other men with sexual desire, and other men can't see her.
So weird.
So
freak. Oh my God.
I know it's like sensory deprivation, but spiritualized.
Yeah, it's like so kinky.
Yeah. And so it's a way of guarding purity, like in this religious context. And so in that sense, I think the veil is public. It's about the community, is to say to the community, like, this woman is not on the market anymore. But in the article that I mentioned about the relationship between pagan and early Christian traditions of marriage, the author points out that in ancient Rome, the veil, first of all, it was red, not white. And the idea in Rome was that the veil represented a fire that protected the couple, not just the woman, but from social judgment and social criticism. So the bride would wear this red veil to say, you may not judge us, and you may not judge the way in which we choose to live our lives from this moment forward. And so it was to prevent the sort of like incursion of judgment into the private life of the couple. And so there, I think the difference is that when the veil symbolizes protecting the couple from others, as it did in Rome, it creates that personal space for the couple. But the more contemporary symbolism of the veil, which is that it protects the woman from sexual corruption and guarantees her sexual purity, it's more about the community.
I wouldn't say that's a more contemporary version of the veil. I think the contemporary...
more Christian, yeah.
The contemporary imagery of the veil is just like, cute.
Well, but that's the symbolic history.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I do think like there's so many questions we could also raise about the extent to which symbolic history matters for the current signifiers and the signifiers that we choose to keep and the ones that we feel, are just kind of too much for us. Like, I think I haven't decided yet whether I'm wearing a veil, but I probably will, but I don't think I'll put it over my head. I think I'll just do it as like a little fashion accessory. So another aspect of the wedding ritual that I think is important here, although it technically happens right after, is the honeymoon. So you have the wedding night, and then especially you have the honeymoon. And the honeymoon, I read in my research, changed in the late 1800s from a time when like the family would go off together to being a time for the couple to go off on their own in private rather than traveling with their family. And that was part of a shift from arranged marriage to companionate marriage in Europe and the US. And this is one of the most popular aspects of weddings, in fact. I read that nearly 100% of straight couples go on honeymoons. That's something that Lori Essig writes about in Love, Inc. And I think the appeal of the honeymoon not only is travel, which people tend to love to do, but also the idea of a getaway, of decompressing, of reminiscing on your wedding. A lot of people talk about that, and or of just like having an exciting new experience together. We're doing a beachy one.
Yay. But I think also the honeymoon symbolically represents, at least like in this more recent history, like a literal departure from family dynamic, right? Where you go off, away. So it's a new journey, it's a new adventure. But I also wonder to what extent the creation of the space of the couple, that which is proper to you and I, requires privacy and holding things off from view, which is what the honeymoon does, right? Because the whole thing is that on the honeymoon, that's when you have like the consummation of the marriage traditionally, and that requires privacy and like the closing of the door to the public. And so I think it is fair to say that there's a lot in the symbolism and the iconography and the history of weddings that tell us that weddings produce a new social ontology, like a new ontological entity that is the couple, that is different from just the individuals and is different from the community. But clearly there are many other aspects of weddings that are not about the couple. They are about that larger community.
Yeah.
And I think for understanding that, we do have to go beyond the specific symbolism of the wedding. And I'm here thinking about the function of weddings more generally in like a sociological and anthropological sense. Because weddings are a tradition, you know, it has, in our case, it has this Roman and Christian baggage. And each time we get wed, every time we have a wedding, we are keeping that tradition alive, right? We are conserving that tradition and ensuring that it goes on into the future. And in that sense, I would say weddings are inherently conservative, not in a political sense of conservative versus liberal, but just like in a broad sense of they conserve a social institution and preserve a social form, right?
Yeah.
The form of the union of two people that is then legally recognized by the state.
Yeah.
And I think the function of that conservatism is that at least in some cases, it can function as a social glue. Yeah. So it's not just that it glues the couple together, it's actually that it glues the whole community together as a social form.
Well, totally. I mean, tell that to the anti-bride, because she's still participating in the conservative tradition. And I'm very aware of the fact that as somebody who in some ways is in a very, non-standard, maybe we would even say subversive couple form, getting married like is super normie. And yeah, that's what you're getting at here through the use of the term conservative. I think that is sad but true. So
yeah, and it also includes gay weddings, right?
Like, yeah. Well, yeah, totally. And I mean, this was like part of the debate within queer theory once same-sex marriage was legalized as well. Like, should we be adopting these traditions? So I want to just quickly bring in here piece of anthropological research that I revisited, having not read it since undergrad for this episode, which is a chapter from Arnold van Gennep's classic 1908 book, The Rites of Passage, because he makes an interesting point in his chapter on betrothal and marriage, where he says marriage is an essentially social act. It is the incorporation of a stranger into a group. And, I think in the contemporary situation, you have the incorporation of two strangers into two different groups. I think beyond that, I'm also thinking about contemporary weddings as ways of strangers meeting one another. Like, David, you're going to meet at my wedding, like, family members from Minnesota, friends from high school, people that you haven't met. I find that just like a really compelling aspect of marriage. And this is also one reason that marriage, according to Van Gennep, is the most important transition from one social category to another. And he has a whole account of the different groups that are involved in weddings. It's not just the couples and their families, but it's also the local group, different associations, right? Like, there will be other academics at my wedding, but there will also be people from other different places in my life. Like, the high school group cares about this and that type of thing. And also, I mean, we can't deny that the two sex groups, like a kind of binary distinction between men and women, this is something that he touches on explicitly, are a big part of the wedding tradition as well. You have your bridesmaids and your groomsmen. That's probably the most obvious example, but there's like a lot of gender binary work that happens in wedding rituals.
I think this point is super important, and the article from Jonathan Wolfe that I mentioned earlier on ceremonies makes a good point about this role that community or communities or groups in the plural play in the actual event of a wedding. And he notes that when we go to a wedding or any ceremony, really, we are reminded that we belong to multiple communities at once, and that therefore our political, social, and ethical commitments are always split or sort of divided across many levels. And those levels can include things like the family, the town, the profession, you just mentioned that, but also he's really focusing on the nation state. And he says that most of the time we think of ourselves through the lens of the nation state, like I'm American, I'm Mexican, I'm British, whatever. But when you go to a wedding, you are reminded that you have commitments to people outside of the nation state. And that's really important, he says, especially at a time when reactive nationalisms are on the rise across the globe, like Brexit, like Trumpism in the US. And so, for instance, if my cousin marries somebody from China, that Chinese person immediately becomes part of my family. And so now, my nationalist self-understanding has to be nuanced in a particular way. And so they bring to the foreground what he calls our sub-nationalist identifications.
Wow.
That we identify with a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I want to think about this very briefly through a particular movie about weddings, because we've been talking about weddings and about also movies and TV. But I asked a colleague of mine if she could recommend a really good movie about weddings that could help us think about the topic for this episode. And she said, well, if you haven't seen Monsoon Wedding, you absolutely have to watch it. It's a movie by Mira Nair, a director who also did Mississippi Masala. And I hadn't
Zora
seen it.
Mamdani's mom.
Exactly. So really interesting connection. So then I realized that I've seen this movie a long time ago, and I found a review in the New York Times by Lisa Schwartzbaum, who writes about the fact that when she saw this movie, and the movie is about this large Indian wedding and all the chaos that happens in the wedding, and then eventually the tensions are resolved.
The chaotic wedding plot.
Yeah, chaotic. We talked about the chaos earlier. But in the New York Times review, Schwartzbaum says that she went to the premiere of that wedding movie on the morning of September 11th, when that movie was premiering in Toronto, Canada. So she is an American visiting Canada to see this film at a festival, and that's when the towers fell. And this review, which was just published last year in 2025, she is reminiscing and sort of thinking back to that moment. And she makes exactly that same argument about nationalism that Wolfe makes in connection to ceremonies and that you alluded to a few seconds ago. And she says, when you are at a wedding or when you watch a movie about a wedding, you can very easily identify with the emotions that motivate people, the reasons that led them to want to get married, the tension during the day of the wedding, the sense of expectation and relief that frames the whole experience. And she says that's because weddings in general, whether in real life or in movies, they require relatively little cultural translation. And she doesn't mean that you can understand all the weddings in all cultures. No,
yeah,
not at
because
all.
I've literally had to have a cultural translation document for Indian weddings where I'm like, oh, this is what that means.
Yeah, no. So it's not that you understand weddings from other cultures automatically, but that you can identify the emotions and you can relate to the emotions and you can acknowledge the significance of that moment for those people. And you can identify in a way that breaks down nationalist ideologies. Mm-hmm. And I like that because obviously there's this now connection where, and I like that because Schwartzbaum is reflecting on this as a New Yorker, seeing a movie in 2001 by the mother of a 9-year-old who will then grow up to be a defender of pluralism in New York City, where the towers fell on the day that she watched the movie directed by his mother.
Well, weddings might be conservative in a loose sense, but we can see here they are by no means nationalist. They actually can resist nationalism, whether by encouraging connections to other cultures or by showing us the universality of the human experience.